Hey Musties! Amazon put out Shin Kamen Rider, or the Shin Mask Rider in some regions, for streaming. I finally got to watch it. I was going to do a review, and then I realized I'm completely out of my element. I'm going to give a brief review of Shin Kamen Rider towards the end, but I really just want to look back at all the live-action Shin-Universe entries. But first, we have to start in 2016. Roughly. Two men, Shinji Higuchi, who was the creator of Neon Genesis Evangelion, and Hideaki Anno, who's a practical effects master and now apparently a special effects master, they teamed up together and decided to recreate Godzilla in the form of Shin Godzilla. And they did so successfully. This was a new high for Toho's Godzilla series, and it was pretty well acclaimed. The film was accessible to a pretty wide audience across the world, with Toho distributing, and the plot was fairly easy to follow along with. Now, the one downside was that there was a lot of government dialogue, which was hard for a lot of Western audiences to handle. But that was kind of the point. The whole point was, in this intertangled bureaucracy of legal red tape, how do we respond to something like Godzilla? Still, it seems as if most Western audiences just wanted action. But even with all that, as some would say, convoluted political dialogue, the aspect of Godzilla itself was very easy to understand for the general audience. Not to mention that awesome cliffhanger, the one with the Godzilla tail. The movie went on to make about $78 million worldwide, and for Toho, that was excellent. There was immediately plans talked about for a Shin Godzilla 2, known as Shin Godzilla's Counterattack. I was looking across Toho Kingdom's forums, and I saw somebody post a quote from the Shin Ultraman Design Works, where Hideaki Anno says, "I wrote a proposal during the filming of Shin Godzilla on February 3rd, 2016, labeled Sequel Shin Godzilla Memo. The primary working title for the project was Shin Godzilla's Counterattack, and with the assumption that Mr. Higuchi would direct. It was meant to be something like a Toho Champion Festival Kaiju Showdown, concocted to be released in 2018, the shortest time possible for a domestic-made Godzilla film to be released. It was a rough draft for people who wouldn't like Shin Godzilla, an idea that wouldn't cost too much or take too long to create. I believed it would be a bad idea to let it go to waste, so I gave the proposal, draft, and visuals as a gift to Mr. Higuchi and Toho. But since it was premature, or whatever, among the other reasons, after the film's release, the discussion ended. While I did feel it was a waste, it's not something I could help since Toho decided what gets made." So while I have my own assumptions about why the film didn't actually get made a sequel, maybe not even Hideaki Anno's sequel, but just any sequel in general to Shin Godzilla, the main reason I think Hideaki Anno's sequel didn't get made is it would have been rushed. They were trying to make a 2-year deadline. I don't know if that was because it had to get released before Godzilla King of the Monsters live-action movie in Hollywood. But also, that in itself would have been a huge change of pace, because the first Shin Godzilla was very slow and drawn out and dramatic. This would have fell in the same line as Godzilla Raids Again, where the first Godzilla film was cinematically iconic, but then the sequel was just a monster mash. And to have Shin Godzilla turn into a mindless fight like that, I don't know exactly how that would have happened. I assume this would have had something to do with Godzilla's tail splitting at the end. I still like the idea in my head of Shin Godzilla returning with an army of small humanoid Godzillas that are just haunting to look at. Sure, the pace could have been better for the sequel, but this drastic change of tone, which is designed for people who don't like the original Shin Godzilla, I feel like that would have been a huge letdown in my opinion, to go to a sequel which was a lot more campier and rushed. That was the key word that stood out the most to me. It was rushed, and I don't want a Godzilla movie that's rushed. Meanwhile, Shin Higuchi began rolling out Evangelion merchandise that would cross over with Godzilla for marketing. We got Godzilla Evangelion pins, trinkets, clothing, and even awesome statues. Unfortunately, by the time 2018 came around, the Toho president stepped out and said, no, there's not going to be a sequel, we're going for an all-new approach, which has now led us to Godzilla -1. While that looks incredible, it's a shame to see what happened, the high standards of something so incredible like Shin Godzilla, to be watered down and dismissed by Toho Studios. More on that as we discuss Shin Ultraman and Shin Kamen Rider. But it wasn't long after that, Higuchi and Anno came forward and announced their new plan, which was a shared cinematic universe between Shin Godzilla, Shin Ultraman, Shin Kamen Rider, and what would be up next is a new movie of Evangelion. And they would call this Shin-Universe the Shin Japan Heroes Universe. Tons of articles came out online talking about this being a new cinematic shared universe like the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And in 2021, we got the next entry, which was Evangelion Thrice Upon a Time. I should have known something was up immediately because this was an anime film in a live-action series. But my mind kind of dismissed it and thought, okay, sure, this might be part of a marketing ploy, but it seems like there's a lot of rumors online, and everybody's talking about this being an interconnected universe, that eventually we're going to get a live-action Evangelion movie. So I dismissed the fact that there wasn't any connection in that sense, and just kept going. The interesting thing about Evangelion is that it's actually the 4th film in the rebuild of Evangelion franchise. So does that mean Evangelion 1, 2, and 3 are also part of the Shin Japan Heroes universe? Either way, I actually kind of set it aside my mind because I assumed this wasn't a direct connection, which kind of leads us up to Shin Ultraman. While Toho had decided to pull the plug on Shin Godzilla 2, I was surprised to see that they were semi-cooperating and allowing in a restrictive way Higuchi and Anno to continue connecting Shin Ultraman in one way or another to Shin Godzilla. Now, the connections came in some fourth wall-breaking ways. Still, the films never really contradicted each other than the drastic change in tone. They fit pretty snugly together even though they don't directly acknowledge each other. After all, Toho is very restrictive of who they let Godzilla collaborate with. Some of these connections appear as a fourth wall-breaking title card in the very beginning of the Shin Ultraman movie, where the name Shin Godzilla appears written in Japanese, only to explode and be replaced by Shin Ultraman. This is, of course, a reference in the title of the Ultraman episodes. Ultra Q would appear, only to explode and be replaced by Ultraman. There are also returning actors in Shin Ultraman, although now they either don't have names or their titles have changed, but you see one or two actors here and there pop up, and you're like, hey, he played a government official in Shin Godzilla. Now he's playing a similar government official in this movie. There's kind of continuity. That slower pace from Shin Godzilla is now sped up, a lot more action and fast-paced, and the characters towards the beginning of Shin Ultraman even reference that, saying, hey, let's cut the bureaucracy tape, let's just respond to these kaiju, we don't have to wait for the government sitting around talking what to do. The final real connection that this movie has to Shin Godzilla is the first kaiju that appears, I guess we would call it Shin Gomez, which uses Shin Godzilla's CGI model, altered to look like Gomez from Ultra Q. Which Ultra Q originally used the Masu Goji suit, the Godzilla suit from Mothra vs. Godzilla and Invasion of the Astro Monster. That literal Godzilla suit was used in the Ultra Q series. They borrowed it and they customized it temporarily to make it its own kaiju known as Gomez. Afterwards, they gave it back to Toho. So Gomez was always based off a Godzilla suit, and so they used the Shin Godzilla model for Shin Ultraman to keep that continuity going. Once again, another fourth wall breaking aspect to make the continuity work. But my mind kind of accepted it. I thought, okay, in this continuity, it kind of makes sense. I kind of just assumed that since we're not seeing a Shin Godzilla sequel, Godzilla's tail, which had begun to split into humanoid-like kaiju, I just pretended that all these Shin Ultraman monsters were actually split off from Godzilla's body. My mind even considered the possibility that that's why Gomez looked like Shin Godzilla's, because he spun off of Godzilla's tail. It was a false assumption. I was just trying to make the connection work until we had official confirmation of where the stuff was going. Since we don't have an answer, it's the closest thing I could get, so I just went with that. And that's pretty much where the connections end. Like I said, they don't really connect, but they definitely don't contradict. Now, there are a lot of differences. Like I said, Shin Ultraman was a lot faster in pacing. The tone changed, a lot more comedic, mostly to adapt to the lower budget. These were different studios who were willing to share similarities, but not the budget. And so, as much as I liked Shin Ultraman, it was a considerable step down in special effects compared to Shin Godzilla. Now, Shin Ultraman's story wasn't quite as simple as Shin Godzilla, where a monster appears in response to humanity's destruction. Shin Ultraman, on the other hand, is more kaiju appear, then aliens appear, and then other Ultramen appear, and it gets kind of elaborate. But it's still fairly accessible to the general public as long as you just read along with the dialogue. Shinji Higuchi also had plans to make a Shin Ultraman trilogy, with Shin Ultra 7 being up next. There has been no update on that, unfortunately, and I'm not going to say anything else because I don't want to jinx the probability of anything else happening in the future. Which finally brings us Shin Kamen Rider, or Shin Mass Rider as it's known in the United States and some other regions. Once again, the budget had changed drastically. It had switched over to another studio and had become even less visually appealing in terms of special effects. Even if this was to connect to Shin Godzilla and Shin Ultraman, there would be a shockingly drastic change in budget quality. That would be hard to go back to something like Shin Godzilla and have this all relate. Once again, there's virtually no connections to Shin Godzilla at this point, or even Shin Ultraman, other than one or two minor actors who play, once again, unnamed roles or just brief cameos, implying that they're in the same country, in the same world. On the bright side, I was very thrilled with all the vintage sound effects that were being used. The music continues to be fantastic. Shin Kamen Rider was also the first of the Shin series to not have Shin Higuchi return, and I believe that there are certain times where that lack of presence is felt. Not to say that Anno didn't do a good job handling this on his own, but perhaps I'm projecting because of the lack of connections to everything else is starting to feel like it's really isolated in its own world at this point. While people criticize Shin Godzilla as being too dialogue heavy, it was at least heavy on the world building elements. Here in Shin Kamen Rider, the dialogue has been mostly replaced with action, and it leaves it feeling unconnected to the rest of the world. I understand that Kamen Rider is dealing with the secret society, but it feels isolated even in its own world. It ends up feeling like the final nail in the coffin for connectivity. This film also becomes very inaccessible to the general public. I mean, it is on Amazon, it's very accessible that way, but it was never shown in theaters. There is currently no English dub, subtitle only. If you know who Godzilla is, you might know who Ultraman is. You probably don't know who Kamen Rider is. The plot gets extremely complicated. They do explain things. They say, this is why things are happening, but don't ever elaborate on how. For example, why couldn't you have said that this technology that they have comes from the aliens that recently appeared on Earth or whatever, and that could have been an indirect reference to Ultraman. At least Shin Godzilla had a subplot explaining some of Godzilla's origins involving that scientist who apparently sacrificed himself. Here, you're just expected to accept that this secret villainous organization exists. Maybe this is partly my fault because I'm not familiar with Kamen Rider, but if you're trying to make Shin Kamen Rider its big grand debut to the general public outside of Japan, I feel like they kind of failed in making it accessible to keep up with. But not only that, but just the way a lot of this was conveyed, and perhaps Ultraman had the same problems, I just didn't know because I was vaguely familiar with Ultraman. But towards the end of the movie of Shin Kamen Rider, new technologies, new attack moves were happening, and there was no explanation of how this was possible or where this came from. Like, sure, we knew Kamen Rider's motorcycle can transform. It's at the end of the movie, and suddenly it can create black holes and warp portals. That caught me off guard. Even the characters admitted, how's this possible? And I don't know, I'm leaving it up to you to explain this. The difference is, in Shin Godzilla, we're rooting for the humans to find a way to stop Godzilla. So when Godzilla pulls out a new surprise weapon, it's a new challenge for the humans to overcome. Here in Shin Kamen Rider, we're supposed to be rooting for Shin Kamen Rider, and yet he keeps pulling out new surprise tricks to stop the bad guys, even at the very end. So there's no real sense of danger or threat because he has an endless bag of tricks to try out. I know Kamen Rider is kind of a superhero, but you don't find out until the end of the movie that he's practically bulletproof. And there's also action scenes that are just hard to keep up with, like the very beginning action scene. He's racing from these trucks. You see Kamen Rider here switch on his bike, and then a truck blows up. Okay, did that shoot a missile at the truck? Because they didn't show a missile. Did he already have bombs planted in the truck that he was just getting ready for the right time to flip a switch? I don't know. Also, this is pretty R-rated. Shin Godzilla had Olympic swimming pool sizes of blood just pouring out of him, but it was monster blood. Here in Shin Kamen Rider, there's a lot of gore. I can't even show you here or else I'd have to censor it, which I was fascinated by and left me saying, oh! Shin Ultraman was kind of soft compared to other Ultraman stuff. Usually, oh, damn! Oh, wow! That's an intro. But surprisingly, you could still argue that the original shows and movie were even more disturbing. But at the same time, it's so different from what we experienced in Shin Godzilla. And maybe Shin Godzilla was supposed to be disturbing, like Shin Kamen Rider. It's just I grew up on Godzilla, and so I didn't find it disturbing. Granted, I thought Shin Kamen Rider was pretty awesome, too, with all the effects. Oh! Whoa! The prosthetics and makeup, wow! But one thing I do love about this movie, in a almost so bad as good kind of way, is just the crazy character stuff. There's a lot of stuff that happens during this that feels like an R-rated version of Super Sentai. And it kind of left me thinking, instead of having Shin Godzilla, Shin Ultraman, Shin Kamen Rider, why couldn't we have had Shin Godzilla, Shin Ultraman, and Shin Super Sentai? I mean, that at least has giant monsters and giant mechs. Kind of connects. The movie does try to delve into some deep philosophy to give this some substantial weight and make it relatable. The whole villain plotline is that the robots have a hard time understanding the difference between happiness and despair when written in Japanese, and that's why they're villains, and they just constantly mix pain for happiness because they apparently have a typo in their program, which kind of feels like a really lame excuse, to be honest. Kamen Rider ends with a pretty open invitation to a sequel. I could definitely see a Shin Kamen Rider sequel happening in the future, though I think it's pretty difficult to work its way back at all to have a sequel to Ultraman or Godzilla. Not just because the studios might say no, but because it's hard to go back and make anything fit after things have changed so much throughout this series. Each of these films in the live action part of the series feel like it's a one-way street. Ultraman can connect to Godzilla, but Godzilla can't connect to Ultraman. And Godzilla doesn't really feel like it can connect to a Kamen Rider because too much has just changed and happened. I mean, technically it could, but it would just feel so messy at this point. Kamen Rider, like I said, it doesn't really connect, but it doesn't dispute anything that happened. I mean, it's still enjoyable to the very end. I would just say just keep branching them off in their own directions. I would love to still see a Shin Godzilla 2, a Shin Ultraman 2. Maybe Shin Godzilla keep doing its own thing and have it not be connected. Take it as a writing challenge. Kind of like Sony and their Spider-Verse kind of connects to the Marvel universe, but Marvel doesn't necessarily connect to the Sony universe. Write your way around that with this. I mean, just have Shin Godzilla do his own thing. Have him be the main universe. Have the Shin Ultraman stories connect and interweave in between there without directly touching that, unless they prove their point and earn enough money that Toho wants to connect, and then I would love to see a Ultraman Godzilla team up. I mean, if the storyline is already this loose, then do a Shin Gamera. Just put Gamera in there. Do a Shin Super Sentai. It's overwhelming too because we waited so long between Shin Godzilla and Shin Ultraman, and then immediately got to Shin Kamen Rider, and the change in tones and the plots happened so quickly. It's overwhelming. Still, Shin Godzilla remains one of the best, arguably you could say the best Godzilla movie ever made. Shin Ultraman is definitely a treat for Ultraman fans, and it's enjoyable how it can easily connect into Shin Godzilla even though it's not necessary. And Shin Kamen Rider, if you have some friends who aren't into nerd stuff, and you really want to make their head spin, and you don't think that they're going to judge you for it, show them Shin Kamen Rider. What would your idea for the future of the Shin universe be? Should they do a sequel to anything? Should they try to connect things together? Should only certain films have sequels? Did you see Shin Kamen Rider? What did you think of it compared to the other movies? Alright, Musties, thanks for watching. And they would call this Shin universe the Shin Japan Heroes United. No, the Shin Japan Heroes Universe.